Coronado and the Seven Cities of Cibola. In the 1400s, European nations were competing to control global trade. Trade brought great wealth to nations. With great wealth came great power. Nations that controlled trade built huge armies and navies. As a result, some nations could easily take over others. Europeans were particularly interested in buying goods they could not get in Europe. They wanted spices, silk, jewelry, carpets, porcelain, and tea from Asia. Traders bought these items at low prices in Asia and then sold them for profit in Europe. During this period, traders traveled mostly by land over trade routes like the Silk Road. The Silk Road connected Europe to China. On the way, it passed through the Middle East. Other routes branched off the main Silk Road and connected to India. Italian cities were Europe's most important trade centers. Italian merchants could leave Italy by ship and travel to the Middle East. From there, they traveled by land to the markets of Asia. Other European countries wanted to find their own trade route to Asia, preferably by water. Travel by water would be faster and easier. Europeans' efforts to find a shorter trade route from Europe to the East Indies resulted in the discovery of the Americas in 1492 by Christopher Columbus. For better or worse, the voyages of Columbus set into motion the conquest of the Americas. Columbus claimed all the land, people, and wealth he discovered for Spain. For hundreds of years after Columbus, other conquistadors sailed to the Americas seeking to serve God, find gold and other precious metals, and gain glory. By the 1530s, after the conquest and establishment of New Spain, stories of gold and riches located to the north had begun to circulate. Conquistador Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca returned from his travels in 1536 and told tales of the 7 golden cities of Cibola. A Spanish missionary, Fray Marcos de Niza, also spoke of seeing golden cities when he followed in de Vaca's footsteps in 1539. Inspired by these fantastical stories, and with the memories of the conquest of the Aztec and Incan empires still fresh in his memory, the first Viceroy of Mexico, Antonio de Mendoza, chose Francisco Vázquez de Coronado to lead a large expedition to explore the northern frontier in February of 1540. Coronado was born into a noble family in Salamanca, Spain in 1510. He came to the Americas in 1535 at the age of 25 as an assistant to Mendoza. In 1537, Coronado put down a major rebellion of Native and African American slaves working in mines, and the next year he became the governor of the important Mexican province of Nueva Galicia. The Coronado Expedition was one of the largest ever. There were at least 300 Spanish soldiers, 3 women, 800 Indian allies, 1,000 Indian and African slaves, and 1,500 animals, including horses, sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. The animals would be killed for food along the way. Following already established Indian trade routes in search of the mythical cities of Cibola, by June of 1540, Coronado reached the Zuni Pueblo of Hawiku. The expedition arrived at the Pueblo during summer ceremonies. Understandably, they were not interested in Coronado's reading of the requerimiento, the standard Spanish demand to native peoples. The Spanish requirement began with the order to acknowledge the Church as the ruler and superior of the whole world, and the high priest called Pope, and in his name the King and Queen of Spain. The next part of the requirement warned the Zuni that if they failed to obey orders, that with the help of God, they would forcefully make war against them and make slaves of them. Not understanding most of what was said, and perhaps angered by what they did understand, the Zuni began firing arrows at the Spaniards, at one point very nearly killing Coronado himself. The better armed and mounted Spaniards quickly entered the Pueblo and forced the Zuni to flee. Although Coronado and his men won the battle, they were disappointed. Instead of 7 golden cities filled with treasure, they found only 6 villages and no gold or silver. Finding no wealth in Cibola, Coronado sent smaller expeditionary forces to explore the surroundings. At the end of August 1540, he sent Captain Hernando de Alvarado eastward to investigate and make contact with any pueblos he found. Alvarado encountered Acoma Pueblo first. The inhabitants exchanged gift goods with the Europeans, and their stay was hospitable, most likely because it was so brief. Another 4 days of travel brought Alvarado to today's Rio Grande, which the Spaniards christened the Rio de Tiwish. The Pueblo peoples of Tiwish were settled in a fertile, well-watered land with a mild climate and sheltering mountains to the east that offered easy access to plants and animals. In the best years, Tiwish farmers could grow enough corn, beans, and squash to supply the community for several years. They also grew cotton and wove cotton clothing. The pueblos of the Rio Grande were large adobe, multi-story communal blocks formed around public plazas. Flat roofs were workspaces and throwaways. There were no ground floor doors. Instead, rooms were accessed by ladders placed against openings in the roof. When Alvarado's party arrived in the Tiwish province, representatives of the Tiwish pueblos presented themselves to the Spanish. According to Alvarado, quote, "The principales and people came from 12 pueblos. They came in order, those from one pueblo behind the other. They walked around our tent playing a flute, and an old man was speaking. In this same way they came into the tent and presented me with food, mantas, and hides they were carrying." End quote. Alvarado sent a letter to Coronado advising him that Tiwish would be a comfortable place to spend the approaching winter. By the end of September 1540, the need for winter housing was urgent, so Coronado sent Garcia Lopez de Cardenas to Tiwish with a troop to prepare winter housing. Lopez de Cardenas and his troop were greeted cordially when they arrived, but that cordiality would not last long. Lopez de Cardenas wanted to build straw huts, but the winter winds and snow were so harsh they did not provide adequate shelter. Consequently, he forced the inhabitants of a pueblo to leave, so the Spaniards could be lodged there. Taking only their clothing, the pueblo's inhabitants took shelter with other friendly pueblos. This pueblo was presumably Santiago Pueblo. Large quantities of crossbow, dart points, and lead balls were found in the vicinity of this pueblo, the lead balls flattened by the impact against the pueblo's adobe walls. In attempting to build his straw huts, Lopez de Cardenas used corn stalks left in the pueblo fields after harvest. Additionally, the Spanish turned their horses and livestock into the harvested fields to graze. This was a blow to the Pueblo peoples, because they kept those corn stalks as winter fuel. Thus the scene for grievance was set before the full expedition reached the Rio Grande. Coronado set out with the expeditionary force to join Lopez de Cardenas once Santiago Pueblo was ready. The winter of 1540 to 1541 was especially cold and snowy, and the Spaniards lacked adequate cold weather clothing. They went around to the other pueblos requesting clothing, but those requests quickly became demands. The Spaniards began taking clothing by force, sometimes directly from the backs of the Pueblo people wearing them. By this point, the Pueblo peoples of Tiwish had been kicked out of their homes, their winter fuel had been destroyed, Pueblo inhabitants had been attacked, and their food and clothing had been stolen. The approximately 12 pueblos that made up the Tiwish province banded together and attacked the Spanish in early 1541. The Spanish retaliated, and after a couple of months of fighting, they had depopulated all the remaining Tiwish pueblos. Many Pueblo people were killed and taken as slaves. Those who survived took refuge with neighboring pueblos. Coronado's expedition took over an additional 2 pueblos for living quarters and demolished and burned the remaining empty pueblos. During Alvarado's initial exploration in the fall of 1540, his expeditionary force made it to the Cacique Pueblo, modern-day Pecos Pueblo, near Santa Fe. It was here that they met a Plains Indian they nicknamed the Turk. He amazed them with his tales of an unbelievably rich land further to the east called Kuvira. The Turks' stories renewed hopes among the Spaniards of finding the great wealth that had thus far escaped them. In April of 1541, Coronado's army set out for Kuvira, guided by the Turk. After 40 long days of travel, Coronado sent most of his men back to Tiwish and continued marching northeast with a small group. Upon arriving at Kuvira, near modern-day Salina, Kansas, they were disillusioned once again. The villages before them were nothing more than grass huts. When pressed for an explanation, the Turk finally confessed that the story of Kuvira was nothing more than a plot conceived by the Pueblo Indians to lure the Spaniards out onto the plains in hopes that they would become lost and eventually die of starvation. In furious anger at having been so gullible and so easily led astray, the soldiers executed the Turk. Coronado and his men soon after began their long, grueling return march back home, bitterly disappointed at having failed their mission. The Coronado Expedition was a bitter failure for the Spanish. In regards to the Pueblo people of Tiwish, despite having the largest combined population in the Southwest, they did not suit the Europeans' plans. The people of Tiwish were primarily corn farmers, but corn was plentiful throughout the temperate and subtropical Americas, and everyone grew it. They did have turquoise, but again, this was abundant. They also produced a variety of glazed pottery, but so did the natives of Mesoamerica, where Spain already ruled. And unlike the native groups of Mexico and Central America, the Tiwish peoples did not have daily markets filled with trade goods. In summary, there were not enough native residents to pay adequate tribute of labor and goods, and the goods they did produce were not highly valuable. When the expedition returned to Tiwish in late 1541, the pueblos that had been repaired and repopulated were quickly abandoned. Fields had been replanted, and the Spanish quickly took them for their use. Coronado set up his second winter quarters in the same pueblos the expedition had inhabited the winter before. The Spaniards went around to the other pueblos, gutting them for firewood and taking any food supplies that had been left behind. At the beginning of April 1542, disappointed by failure, the expedition packed up and left the Rio Grande Valley to return to Mexico. There, the viceroy branded Coronado's expedition a miserable failure. Coronado managed to resume his governorship, but within several years he was found guilty of numerous atrocities against the Indians under his authority. He was removed from office in 1544 and moved to Mexico City to work in a modest position in the municipal government. He died in 1554, decades before the chronicle of his expedition was finally published. Coronado and the Spanish thought that the expedition to the north was a failure. They had not found gold or silver. They found no Indian empires, and few Indians wanted to convert to Christianity. Nevertheless, the Spanish learned a lot about the people who lived on this frontier. They also learned about its geography. They explored the Grand Canyon to the west and the flat expanse of the Great Plains to the east. In between, they explored the Rio Grande Valley as well as the Sangre de Cristo and Sandia Mountains. Despite these discoveries, the Spanish concluded that this land was not ready for large-scale settlement. 60 years would pass before the Spanish returned permanently to the area to settle and exploit its resources.